Dragger, an original novel by Robert Napier, narration and images powered by AI. Chapter 1. We're all trapped here. Your name is Dex. After several days of riding through the hills of the moorlands, that was all he had said to the little girl. It was impossible to tell who or what he was under the bony plate of his mask, but his voice was low and certain. She didn't question it. She sat behind him on his large black horse, nodding off with her head against the dense fur of his cloak. She would awaken from a nightmare to a reality she didn't recognize. Her fingers ached, but instinctively clung to him to keep her place in the saddle. She was small, and the thought of falling from the horse terrified her. It wasn't the fear of hitting the ground, but of dropping through the veil of mist and finding no ground at all. Land and sky merged into a single gray thing. A drape of clouds and fog lay on the travelers like a lingering fever. It seemed to Dex that the next step would send them tumbling over the edge of the world. They followed the fog through ranks of half-dead trees and woody grasses. Dex had not the slightest idea where they might be going to, since no one spoke in the somber column. The line of horses stretched out of sight. Dex considered they had all died somehow and were gliding together into the grave. Eventually, she concluded that she was not dead. The proof she found was the constant slosh of mud underfoot. Ghosts aren't muddy, and they certainly don't shiver and sneeze all day. The only time anyone spoke was when they stopped to camp for the night. The only way Dex could tell it was night was because they stopped to camp. When those around her did speak, it was always muted and raspy, and cluttered with words she didn't know, like infiltrate, bludgeon, and fuck. She could see the glow of 3 campfires, hers being in the center. She sat very close to it because the leader, called Dragger, kept the flame quite low. Or perhaps that was all the fire they could muster out here. Dragger sat on the other side of the fire. He, or it, was draped over with a heavy black cloak and furs. His face was covered by a scary mask. He wore a boar skull like it was his own. Dex recognized it as a pig by the 2 tusks sticking out where the cheeks should be. But it was riveted and strapped into a jagged steel frame around his face. He sat motionless all through the night, and Dex began to wonder if the one they called Dragger was a fog spirit summoned to possess a pile of animal parts. They protected towns along the border. These soldiers wore simple jerkins with white pauldrons and greaves. The white of their clothing took on the colors of their surroundings, so that their legs were muddy and green, while their torsos were soggy gray. They treated Dex like any obstacle, stepping over her or kicking her aside. It was only under Dragger's instruction that she received any care. Her hands were badly cut, and some of her fingers were crooked and swollen. When Dragger's powerful hand squeezed hers, she thought he meant to tear her arms off. But after a sharp pop that made her whole body shake, she saw her fingers straightened. A stern female Crucian bandaged Dex's head. She hadn't realized her head was injured until she saw blood on the woman's hands. It might have been the 4th night by the campfire, if Dex had been counting, when someone asked, "Why is she here?" Dex didn't think much of the question, as she did not realize it was about her. No clear answer was given, except the stern woman remarked, "Dead men don't talk." It was only after feeling his eyes on her that she noticed this dead man, by his face and build, Dex assumed he was just another soldier. She couldn't think of any specific examples, but she felt confident dividing adults into two kinds: parents or soldiers. They didn't have to be her parents, mind you, but someone's parents. These were adults you could hug onto, and they might brush your hair or give you something to eat. Dex hadn't seen any of that type lately. The other kind was soldiers. Those kinds you just had to obey if you couldn't avoid. Dex thought she might recognize him, but she had probably seen him through the fog earlier that day, or the day before. She spent most of the journey with her face buried in Drager's cloak, and didn't see much of anything. But if this man was going to stare at her, she would stare back. She noticed his clothes were brighter colored than the others, though dirtier. He had a bandage on his leg, like the one on her head, and his hands were tied together at the wrist. Dex wondered what the purpose of that might be. She had seen grown-ups wearing bracelets, but tying them together seemed an awful inconvenience. Sitting on a rotting log near the dying fire, Dex tested this theory by holding her wrists together and reaching for things around her: a stick and a tuft of grass. She discovered her own coarse tunic had a pocket on either side. They were empty, and she had nothing to put in them, but she felt certain it would be difficult to use them with her hands tied to each other. She contemplated this problem well into the night. It wasn't much, but it helped her pass the time until she finally fell asleep. The next morning, Drager pulled her from the ground, still asleep, and dropped her on the back of his black horse. She was barely able to keep in the saddle as she rubbed her eyes and yawned. She didn't want to ride horses anymore, but she didn't want to sit in the mud either. She longed for something different, something she felt was at hand, but couldn't grasp what it might be. She just didn't want this. She could see Drager's shadow in the morning fog, so she knew he hadn't gone far. She was strangely calmed by his presence. He had handled her roughly, bossed and bullied her, but she felt that so long as he was near, nothing else would dare harm her. That's when she was hit from behind. She fell forward in the saddle, nearly sliding off if she hadn't grabbed the horse's mane. It pained her fingers, but happened anyway. Two arms wrapped around her, startling her. The first thing she saw was the bound wrists. The hands took the reins and pulled hard. There was no sense in it, but Dex tried to wiggle loose. Of course, if she had gotten free, she would have fallen from the horse, but she didn't like being squeezed. "Hold still, damn you," the man cursed her. "I'm taking you." The dead man steered the horse off the fog path and down an embankment. The whole world was green and soggy, and even if this were a small hill, the animal couldn't move the way the rider wanted. Dex was terrified of how he growled and grunted. As he pulled the reins back and forth, she was buffeted by his arms. When the horse reached easier ground, a sharp whistle cut the fog. The horse became rigid, and its ears spun back. The dead man bounced in the saddle and kicked his heels in the horse's flanks, but it would not move. The rider swung his leg over to dismount, but with hands bound and Dex between them, they both plummeted to the ground. Dex was content to lie there, at least long enough to get her thoughts together, but the dead man jerked her by the arm. He hobbled several paces, but Dex and his own bandaged leg drug behind him. Then they were struck from both sides by white soldiers. Dex rolled and covered her ears until she felt Drager's hand on her tender head. She knew it was his hand by the size and weight of it. "Don't be scared," he said. Dex opened her eyes and saw the leader kneeling over her. Her mind wanted to obey him, but her heart was still afraid. Drager pushed back his helmet. He was an older man with a thick, black, gray beard and piercing blue eyes. "That man is very dangerous, but I'll make sure he can't hurt anyone anymore. I'm taking you both someplace safe." Dex saw the dead man being wrapped in chains by several white soldiers. He glared at her, blaming or expecting something, but she didn't know what. Dex was frightened by the man's stare, and just as she had grabbed the horse's mane, she pulled Drager's beard and tried to hide in his arms. The black horse was still standing rigid, awaiting the master's order. Drager replaced Dex in the saddle, led them to the top of the hill. Before mounting in front of her, Drager lifted her chin with his armored hand. "You've done well. Can you stay brave for me?" Dex nodded. Just like that, the idea of sitting in the saddle felt less like a treacherous chore and more like keeping an important promise. They began the day's ride. Just as Dex settled into the certainty that the entire world was mud and fog, the air filled with a smell so foul she nearly vomited, but couldn't because her stomach was empty. When the horses finally stopped, a white-clad soldier snatched her unawares from the saddle and dropped her in the mud so the wind was knocked out of her. As she recovered from the blast, she heard the grunts and squeals of pigs, and the smell was terrible. Drager's feet crashed down beside her as he dismounted, splashing mud in her face. He walked away. She fought for breath. "Hey!" she shouted, her own voice strange in her ears. "Hey, where are you going? Where are we?" Drager looked over his shoulder, breath pluming between the long tusks of his mask. "Home, child." Drager and his soldiers left their horses and marched scattered towards a compound. It was part mansion, part castle, but mostly pig farm, with an encircling stone wall. Dex had seen pig farms before, but could remember when. There were also structures strange to her, bulky and square, some with 3 stories, a feat she hadn't realized was possible. The ground was mossy and soft, turning muddier as she approached. She felt compelled to follow the soldiers. They had left her to die several times already. If she didn't keep up, she would be left all alone. She felt she had to stay next to Drager. The shadow of the big leader seemed her only charm against deprivation and death. Dex followed Drager's deep footprints until she caught up with the soldiers at the gate of the square building. They stood outside and stripped off their white armor. In the cool morning air, steam rose off their bare skin. They were revealed to her as men and women, actual people like herself. And even as she walked by, they began to dress in different garments. There were others there too she hadn't seen before. They were all silent. Dex had never seen a gathering where no one spoke, and it chilled her more than the howling wind. She watched the soldiers exchange their white armor for dark robes and leather that was tattered, spiked, and bony. Their faces vanished under cowl and visor, armored masks like Drager, becoming horrific, tortured faces. She was so caught up in this bizarre exchange that she hadn't noticed Drager standing in front of her. His dark shape loomed overhead, so that she was startled at the sight of him. "Who are they?" she asked. They were soldiers before, but now there's something else. He told her nothing she didn't know already, but the heat of his voice made her own thoughts more real. She trembled, fearing she and the massive dark thing were somehow the same. Slowly, he added, "They are soldiers within soldiers, an army within an army." Dex watched as the strange figures dispersed into the various buildings across the compound. "They are my children, like you. You are my warghoul." Warghoul? Dex tasted the word and didn't like it. What's that? Lost souls, without purpose or direction. I am their father. I am your father. You're not my father, protested Dex, though she was unsure of most everything. Of course he is. A woman appeared from behind Drager's massive form. She was just barely beautiful, tall, composed, businesslike, yet ornate. Her head and body were adorned in tight clothes and loose jewelry, with a clinking necklace of glass around her neck. "I'm your Aunt Ruby," she said, showing faint lines around her bright red lips. "No," said Dex flatly. She didn't remember much, but her empty stomach turned on those lies. Drager stood silent, unmoving. Ruby gestured for one of the strange soldiers Drager had called a warghoul. When the warghoul appeared, Ruby huffed. "Take it to the sty. Until it learns to obey like a good child, we'll treat it like an animal." Dex was jerked forward. She tried to resist, but was pitifully small, and her bare feet glided in the mud. She was pulled by the arm to a large enclosure made of many layers of boards and stones. The grunting of pigs resonated off the slats of the barn walls. The sound was so low you could hear it with your bones. There was a row of stalls running the length of the structure. The backs of the animals were visible over the dividers, bristly and muscular. They were at least 3 times the size of any pig Dex had ever seen. "Gore sows," said Ruby. Dex watched the black snout of one of the beasts rooting under the gate of its pen. The hot breath swirled and floated over the cool mud. "They call our Lord Drager the Gore Slayer, since he slew the deadly gore of Peel." Ruby paced ahead of Dex and the warghoul. But since then, he has learned to respect the race, not to tame them, but to give them purpose. The groans of the beasts frightened Dex, but she had promised to be brave. She scuttled along with Ruby down a winding flight of stairs. "That's what you lack," said Ruby. "Focus." Adjusting to the low light, Dex saw she was in a stone room with mud up to her ankles, and the only light came through gaps in the roof. "This is our little shotery. I don't have the resources for another ghoul, and neither does Drager, whether he'll admit it or not. He may think he knows what's best for children, but I know what's best for me." Ruby shoved her forward. Dex fell face first into the muck. When she scrambled to her feet, slipping and heavy with cold, wet mud, she turned just in time to see Ruby gone, and the door slammed shut. Dex banged her fists on the door, but it was secured against far stronger creatures than her. Resigned, she turned. She wasn't alone. There were gore piglets, the size of jackals, but twice as thick, zigzagging through the mire. They rushed to her, thinking she might be food. Dex scrambled in the sucking mud. The piglets were dense with muscle, and despite their weight, moved with an agility Dex couldn't match. Aiming for the soft pink snouts, she kicked her way to a clearing. There were maybe a dozen of the energetic black gores ranging in size and maturity, but pound for pound, she was the smallest. The shotery was quite large, with plenty of space for the young gores to run and play and grow. There were several rooms and tiers, an artificial landscape, all coated in filth. 2 large ducts ventilated the area, poking up to the air above. These were the only sources of air and light in this underground chamber. Frantic with anger and terror, Dex found an elevated platform too steep for the piglets, that she could climb up and find a measure of respite. She curled up on this little perch and cried the mud out of her eyes. There's no telling how much time passed before a gentle sprinkle woke her. It was daylight, but Dex wasn't sure whether she had slept through the night or not. It was raining, and some of the precious droplets fell on her face and hair. She held out her tongue to catch so much as she might to quench her aching thirst. "What's your name?" a voice called out. Opening her eyes, Dex saw up the tube a boy looking back at her. He was a little older than her. His face was pale and drawn, expressionless, but she couldn't focus clearly. "Dex, I think. That's a stupid name. I'm Vago. Can you help me? Are you thirsty?" Yes, she stammered, though her throat was sharp with dryness. "Please help me," she pleaded. "I'm trapped here." "Hang on," said the boy, and he instantly vanished. "Hey!" she cried out. "Hey, help me! Don't leave me! Hey!" But the boy was gone. Dex banged on the duct, producing a ponderous noise that likely only she could hear. "Hey!" the boy reappeared. Dex had never been so relieved to see anyone. She lifted her arms to implore the boy to raise her from the pit. "Here." Vago dumped a bucket down the shaft. The rush of chilly water gushed over Dex, filling her nose and mouth, choking and drowning her. She was aghast at the sudden blast of frigid water. She coughed and shivered and started to cry again. When she was able, she looked up again at the sallow boy. He was staring back at her. "Welcome to Gnarlstead," he whispered. "We're all trapped here." Dex collapsed on herself and cried. She lay isolated atop this tier, between the open sky and the mud swirling with gore piglets, until some twisted and gawky form of sleep overtook her. When she woke, it was night. She could see the moon hovering over the vent. The young gores had nestled down in a mass to sleep. Dex, stiff from lying in a heap, stretched her dirty limbs and climbed off the tier. The moonlight poured into the sty from the several vents, giving her some sense of her prison. By the sound of snoring, she was able to avoid the pods of piglets and explored the area as best she might. At the back of the sty was a low wall that she mounted and found a small room blessedly free of gores. There were a few trappings of human life: straw shaped into a mat, a tattered blanket, cracked cookware, and a short stool. This area was not well lit, and Dex had to feel along the walls to get an idea of the size and shape of the area. In so doing, she found a hole broken into the slats of the wall, where, with some wiggling, she could fit herself into. The walls were poorly constructed, with a simple wooden frame spiked into the peat and clay of the ground. Dex could fit her small body between the cold dirt and the wall and climb the slats like a ladder. She couldn't see far in the dark, so she didn't dare to climb higher than she could safely fall. She was not thinking of escape, but only following an instinctual urge to put a barrier between herself and the world. She trembled there for unknown hours, miserable and angry. Sick and quivering, she noticed through the cracks the glow of a candle. She made her way cautiously toward it. She climbed through a snug breach in the stone foundation into a space between walls loosely filled with rubble. Though there was no way she could have realized it, the underground chaudry beneath the sty met with the foundation of the manor house. Peering through the cracks, the first thing she saw was the dead man. He was shackled to the wall across from her. His brightly colored clothes were torn, bloody, His face was swollen and sweating. She felt he should be familiar to her in some way, but all her memories were scattered, dim and formless. Dragger entered the room. The flooring creaked under his weight. His stare lingered on the dead man. A glint of steel turned in his hands. Dex shifted to see. Dragger held an enormous sword. It was longer than Dex's body, and probably twice as heavy. He held it as if it were a silken scarf. With considerable effort and disgust, the dead man spoke. General Dragger, North Raider, Goreslayer called. You're so blunt and clumsy. You have no right to even touch my sword, a Vinian sword, when people hear you've attacked. Don't lie, interrupted Dragger. It's ugly and civilized. The general moved closer. You and I, old friend, we're beyond all that now. He drove the heavy sword into the floorboards, and the whole structure groaned from the blow. Dex gasped. She quickly covered her mouth, afraid of being discovered. Releasing the sword to stand freely, General Dragger removed his helmet and set it upon the swaying hilt. His hair was neatly tied atop his head, and his eyes were icy blue. You weren't on any mission from the Council, Commander Dweller. You crossed that bridge on your own. Dragger turned his back on the dead man and stepped away. Even without the mask, his voice was hollow and deep. Your Vinian knights, with Vinian swords, murdered villagers, in the street, no less. And what about your assassins? Scolded the chained commander. They killed Jozen citizens on Jozen soil. Do you have proof? Dex heard the shuffling footsteps of several others in the room, but couldn't see them. He won't confess to anything, said Aunt Ruby, appearing in the doorway. Dex didn't need to see her to recognize the sound of her glass necklace chiming as she walked. I'm not interested in a confession. Our troops already destroyed the Deltaic outpost. As far as anyone knows, Commander Dweller attacked the village without provocation, and we responded accordingly. A dingy man hunched over in a long coat spoke up. Father Dragger, it appears one of the jokers escaped from the outpost ahead of us. Dragger turned to the dirty man, clearly annoyed that he spoke out of turn, and in front of their captive. Then he must be hunted down. There will be no one to contradict us. I'm part of the Imperial Council, shouted the dead man. The knights you attacked were on pilgrimage to Daloran. No, Commander, you're an invader and a war criminal. You're pig-headed as ever, General Dragger Goreslayer, milk drinker, mule driver, whatever undeserved title you're pretending to these days. I'm done trying to reason with you. Why did you bring me here? What do you want from me? I don't know, said Dragger, scratching in his beard. Nothing, if I'm being honest. You are irrelevant, especially now. I just thought it'd be nice to reminisce. Dragger paced around in silence before turning softly to unseen others in the room. Take him to the cellar. Ruby pressed herself into Dragger. She was much shorter, and she nuzzled her cheek against his armored chest. Tell me what you're going to do with him. Keep him here, he said without gesture. Keep him? What does that mean? Ruby pushed herself away from Dragger, but her hands lingered on his body. Well, if you won't kill him, the Jozen would pay a fortune for him. He's worth more to me here. Ruby took a sharp breath and pursed her lips. He's not worth anything here. You promised me a palace? Where are my gowns? Where are my servants? Soon, Mishku. I have brought you many slaves. Ruby stormed back and forth. You took me away from my home, my family. I was rich. I had fine furniture, tapestries, silver and porcelain, paintings and jewels, taffeta and velvet. I lived in a palace. You were wretched, betrothed to a stammering pewter peddler. He was a nice man, unlike you. He was weak. I snapped his spine with my bare hands. Ruby stopped in her storm track. Her shoulders jittered as she bit her nails, and her eyes sparkled up at Dragger. Yes, you did, darling. That was the most thrilling night. I want you to break Commander Dweller like that, just for me, just like my sister. No. Ruby stepped back, took a hard look at everyone in the room. Dragger, the dead man, the war ghouls. Then she bent forward and screamed full blast. It scared Dex, and she nearly fell down the chute between the walls. Ruby slapped at Dragger. 2 swipes landed without any reaction. When she came at him with her fingernails, he caught her hand and squeezed. Ruby's face reddened as she tried to pull back. The bones of her hand crackled and her knees buckled. Come on, you know I love you, baby. I'd do anything for you. She winced, but Dragger held fast. You're a god. You're a king. Ruby slid down to her knees, and tears formed in her eyes. Dragger released her arm, and it flopped to the floor. Ruby stood, straightening her tight clothes and precisely plucking a tear from her cheek. She cradled her arm as it shook. She sniffed and laughed. I can't stand sentimental men. What about me, Father? The dingy war ghoul spoke out. What now? Dragger stared for an uncomfortable period of time. You were told not to act without my orders. Now, I've got a mess to clean up. The dingy man dropped to his knees where Ruby had been. Forgive me, Father. I have been away from your teaching for too long. Living among the Jozen made me soft and foolish. But I have brought you Commander Dweller, the heretic, your rival. Rival, repeated Dragger, scratching his dark gray beard. He considered the word carefully as he left the room. Aunt Ruby took Dragger's place, and the man pleaded with her. Auntie, please. I didn't think they would follow me so far. Oh, my dear, said Ruby, running fingers through his hair. You're just a failure, that's all. The other war ghouls instantly seized him, preventing him from standing. The dingy man's face tightened around his skull as the color drained from his cheeks. Father wants me alive. I'm valuable. I'm justified. You can't do anything to me. I'm a war ghoul. Father wants me alive. You have to obey him. You have to. Ruby did not like being told what she had to do. She squeezed his chin and leaned so close their noses touched. I'm sure he'll be very annoyed to hear you've disappeared. Father, Father, please, Father. Dex covered her ears, but couldn't block his screams. Ruby laughed and danced, giddy for the struggle. She pried the dead man's sword from the floorboards. At first, it appeared she would swing the sword overhead, but she tottered under the weight, and instead brought it far to one side, giving the dingy man time enough for one quick "No!" before slashing recklessly across his chest and stomach. The war ghouls released him to step clear of Ruby's swing. He collapsed on the floor just ahead of a spreading ooze of blood and organs. Dex cringed and closed her eyes. She couldn't watch any more horror. Ruby gasped from the effort, but more from the thrill. She fixated on the dark blood drooling off the bright steel. Slowly, she noticed the dead man's glower. What's the matter? It's what you wanted. You would have done the same thing. Ruby pouted. Oh, if only you had realized sooner he was one of our children. Sure, we trained him how to act like a joker. she smirked. But he wasn't even a very good spy. Just look at all this fuss. Ruby tested the tackiness of his blood that had dribbled onto her fingers. She wiped her hand across the chained man's face and neck. He twisted under her caress, but there was nowhere he could go. I wonder how annoyed Dragger would be if I killed you too. We will take him to the cellar, rasped one of the ghouls. Well, go on then, snapped Ruby. She puckered her thick lips at the chained man. I guess you're staying a while. Who knows? You might like it here. Learn to embrace what you can't escape. I have. The ghoul pointed at the body on the floor. What should we do with him? Ruby answered with a click of her tongue. Who cares? Feed him to the hogs.